In a recent video, I mentioned this event at Lewis and Clark Law School, at which Christina Hoff Sommers was supposed to give a talk titled The Closing of the Feminist Mind. And if you missed it, here are some highlights.
Check! Mic check! We choose! We choose! To protest! To protest! Male supremacy! Male supremacy! Not give it! Not give it! A platform! A platform! Christina Sommers has repeatedly delegitimized the suffering of women! Worldwide! But we believe! Our siblings! And our comrades! Women are not! Liars with victim mentalities! Rape culture is not a myth! Microaggressions are real! The gender gauge gap is real!
Now, I didn't catch that the first time round, but some of you did in the comments. But for those that didn't, listen again.
The gender gauge gap is real!
So she actually says the gender gauge rap is real. The fact that her jacket says "Stay woke" makes it even more hilarious. And of course, they went on to chant this awe-inspiring mantra.
What side are you on, friends? What side are you on? What side are you on, friends? What side are you on? No platform for fascists, no platform at all. And we will fight for justice till Christina's gone. Which side are you on, friends? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, friends? Which side are you on?
Now, while that's good for a laugh, what has happened since then is equally bizarre, but not quite so funny. So this lecture that Sommers was not able to give was held on March 5th. Now, Andy No was there and was the one responsible for capturing the footage that you see here and releasing it on social media. And so after a few days of bad publicity, Lewis and Clark released a statement. The first paragraph states, "On March 5th, Christina Hoff Sommers, invited to Lewis and Clark Law School by a student group as a speaker, was disrupted by a few protesters at the beginning of her speech. After a few minutes, she was able to continue, and students engaged in a vigorous discussion during the question and answer session." Now, Christina Hoff Sommers has since penned an article that appeared in the Wall Street Journal titled, "The Gender Gauge Rap is Real." That just keeps on giving, doesn't it? There's got to be a t-shirt in that, surely. So in the Gender Gauge Rap is Real, Sommers gives her take on the incident. In response to the paragraph by Lewis and Clark, she states, "In fact, it was more than a dozen. The interruptions were constant, and I wasn't able to finish my lecture. The statement did affirm the school's commitment to free speech and promise appropriate disciplinary action against the disruptors." Elsewhere in the article, she notes, "The demonstrators were ridiculous, but they got their way. Miss Stevison," that's the Dean of Diversity and Inclusion, "gave up, cut my speech short, and urged me to start taking questions. At first I resisted. This was supposed to be a lecture, not a deposition. But she was adamant. She seemed like a middle school principal trying to restore order during a playground brawl. But these were law students in a classroom." So clearly this is damage control. Other interesting tidbits from Sommers' article. "When I arrived at Lewis and Clark Law School to give a talk, a security officer asked if I had a gun. She'd heard rumours on social media. I didn't, but my friend Andy No, a Portland State grad student, was armed with an iPhone. So some unhinged lunatic goes out and starts spreading false rumours that Hoff Sommers was carrying a gun. Yeah, that sounds reasonable." Also, a letter from several leftist student groups had demanded the Federalist Society disinvite me. It described me as a known fascist whose speech would constitute violence against victims of gendered oppression. So I tracked down this letter, and it actually comes from the National Lawyers Guild of Portland, Oregon student chapter, released the day before the event on March 4th. "Friends," I think that's an error, it should say comrades. "We have recently become aware of a troubling event being held within the confines of our community. Under the guise of open debate and free discourse, the Federalist Society found it necessary to unilaterally invite a known fascist to our campus to encourage what we believe to be an act of aggression and violence toward members of our society who experience racial and gendered oppression. Christina Sommers has repeatedly made remarks in order to delegitimise the suffering felt by women across the world and to embolden male supremacist groups, including the men's rights activist movement and Milo Yiannopoulos. Sommers has called the epidemic of sexual assault on campuses and the gender wage gap myths, refuses to recognise genderqueer and gender non-conforming persons, and denies the existence of male supremacy. Because of the way systematic oppression manifests, we know those who live at intersections of oppression, cis and trans women of colour, genderqueer and gender non-conforming persons of colour, bear the brunt of this attempt to legitimise gendered violence. By giving a mainstream voice to such groups, Sommers gives credibility to this reactionary rhetoric. Now, I know this has become routine for radical leftists. Just throw out bigotry bingo labels, don't make arguments, just practice truth by assertion. But how unhinged do you have to be to call Christina Hoff Sommers a fascist? And if you actually asked for evidence of their claims, you know you would get some taken out of context misrepresentation of what she actually said. Take this, for example.
So then if I was intoxicated during my sexual assault, but I was not incapacitated, does that mean it was okay for the guy to force my head in his lap?
That's different. You did not listen.
That's what you just said.
No, you did not. No, I said that when they are studying and asking questions, and they're not about force, but if they're asking about force, then of course we would call that assault. But if the only question is, were you intoxicated? We need to know more. That's all. We need to know that if there was force, yes. If there was incapacitation, definitely. If you were just practically blackout, yes. But if you were drunk, maybe. But we need to know more. That's what I said.
Why does that change anything?
This is a clear inability to listen, to put aside your emotions and understand nuance. And of course, often that is deliberate, not accidental. But wait, this letter gets even better. We call on the Federalist Society to rescind their invitation to have Christina Sommers speak on campus. We live in an age where we have come to an understanding of how power works. Those calling for debate of marginalised people's humanity fail to recognise how unevenly political power is able to be wielded. Now, we understand how language works and how it can be used to reproduce the systems of oppression. We know we must resist it at all costs. Instead of recognising this and moving forward, some in our community choose to remain in denial of this truth by assertion and act to stifle progress in an attempt to preserve the status quo. Free speech is certainly an important tenet to a free, healthy society, but that freedom stops when it has a negative and violent impact on other individuals. There is no debate here. Now, this is just straight out of Postmodernism 101. Listen to the hysterical exaggerations. Challenging the idea of rape culture on university campuses is debating the humanity of marginalised people. This was the same accusation levelled at Peterson when he started speaking out about compelled speech in relation to pronouns. It is totally unhinged. So the letter finished with a call to protest Sommers' event, and it is signed by the aforementioned National Lawyers Guild, Lewis and Clark Student Chapter, the Minority Law Student Association, Women's Law Caucus Immigration Student Group, and the Jewish Law Society. And down the bottom of the first page, you'll see a little note that states, the National Lawyers Guild is an association dedicated to the need for basic change in the structure of our political and economic system. So a bunch of commies, basically. Remember, this is a law school, and as Christina Hoff Sommers said in her article, law students are usually older and more sensible than undergrads, and they're supposedly learning how to argue for a living. Most Lewis and Clark students, progressives and conservatives, are easygoing and committed to free expression. But that didn't stop the bullying minority students from turning up the volume. And it is worth remembering that this is a bullying minority, but the bullying minority is having an effect outside the universities and not just in HR departments. It's affecting the law profession. Remember the National Labour Relations Board memo that concluded, amongst other ridiculous things, that James Damore's memo created an unsafe work environment, even though he was just responding to requested feedback. I've also briefly mentioned the recent incident in Canada in which the Law Society of Upper Canada required legal professionals to sign on to a statement of principles confirming their obligation to promote equality, diversity and inclusion, and rejected an exemption for conscientious objectors, which amounted to supporting discrimination, which is what diversity and inclusion is usually all about. Anyway, after all the drama at Lewis and Clark, the same cabal of students from the Lewis and Clark Law School student chapter came out with another long-winded diatribe of nonsense, which seems to be geared towards diffusing any disciplinary action because of the statements made in the original press release from Lewis and Clark. Quote, "We do not condone the intentional efforts by a few students to prevent this speaker from communicating her views to the vast majority of students who were willing to hear and debate them. The law school is taking appropriate disciplinary actions in accordance with school policies." But just listen to some of the lunacy in this second letter. Sommers posits herself as an academic, but her arguments and ideology uphold and provide mainstream and legitimate cover to male supremacy. See the Southern Poverty Law Centre for more on this. I mean, you're getting desperate when you're citing the Southern Poverty Law Centre as legitimacy for your arguments. We do not doubt that part of the intent of people like Sommers is provocation, particularly because there has been an onslaught of anti-protest legislation all over the country, which impedes rights to protest and has profound implications for movements for social justice. But even the provocateur stylings of these figures are just another gimmick in their larger role of capitalising on campus respectability politics in order to provide cover for white supremacist and male supremacist ideology. The fact that Sommers won't denounce or even bother to distance herself from the so-called men's rights activists and more overt white supremacists further shows how oppressive structures reinforce each other and her compliance in upholding them. Just remember, these are future lawyers. And no, it's not enough to say, well, no one will hire them. They are being hired, and they are increasingly affecting people's lives. As usual, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you next time.